So our final speaker this afternoon is Nancy Davenport. She's an artist and professor in the Graduate Fine Arts program at the University of Pennsylvania. Her photographs and digital video works have been widely exhibited in museums and galleries around the world, including biennials in Liverpool, Istanbul, and Sao Paulo, and here in New York at ICP and at the Nicole Klagsbrun Gallery in Chelsea. 2 photographs from her series, The Apartments, are currently on view here upstairs at the Met in After Photoshop, Manipulated Photography in the Digital Age. Today, she'll be discussing the strange circumstances surrounding the debut of that body of work in 2001, as well as other aspects of her artistic practice in her talk titled The Apartments and Other Selected Works. Please welcome Nancy Davenport.
Patient. I'm just gonna set up. Thank you. Thanks, Mia, for inviting me today, and thanks to all my fellow presenters. It's been a really interesting day. I hope I'm nearly as interesting as you guys were. Let me just open this. So, for this panel, Mia asked me to focus on a work I did over 10 years ago called The Apartments, and I'm happy to do so. But at the same time, I have to say it's a challenge not to focus on the most recent thing. The familiar, the overwhelming impulse is to talk about, to run through a condensed version of the past until I can get to the stuff that I'm working on. Sometimes when you're focusing on older work, you can feel like a slave to a former self. But as an introduction, before I focus on 2001, I'm going to go backwards chronologically, super quickly through my work, like Martin Amos's Time's Arrow, and try to briefly sum up some of the things that are consistent through all my work. Very, very generally, a lot of my photography is focused on architecture as a symbolic space, as a highly charged social space. Most recently, I've been shooting at the United Nations Security Council chamber, and I'd love to talk about it if you want to ask me about it during the question period. Throughout my work, I've also consistently explored specific histories of political engagement and the shifting relationship between individuals and institutions. For this one extended series that I did called Workers, I shot the employees and the industrial architecture of one global company. I traveled to their factories in Europe and then to China. Basically, I was following a common path of outsourcing. When they started closing their facilities in Europe and opening new ones in Asia. This is an aluminum factory in Norway, which I shot right before the company closed it down and all the workers were fired. And then I went to China and shot the company's new factory that they had just opened in Xi'an. So although I've worked with a lot of different media, I've done videos and films and online projects and magazine projects and poster projects. Most of my work is evenly divided between still photographs and animations that use stills. This is from the same Workers series, and it's an animation. It consists entirely of still shots. It's a collage of different locations, people working in different facilities. And in this sequence, it follows a line of workers through a factory and then out this door where they board a space shuttle and blast off and circle the Earth, eventually returning back to the factory. So I'm showing these stills just to show you the very, very basic animation techniques that I'm interested in, where the movement is really funky and purposefully primitive in what I hope is an interesting way. And it's actually very close to the slide animation of the 1950s, like Looney Tunes. Wait. So these are stills from another project, moving backwards in leaps and bounds. This piece was called Weekend Campus, and this piece is also an animation, like the workers' piece. It has a very basic horizontal movement. And there's some punctuating lighting effects. It's actually a very long Photoshop document, a collage of hundreds of stills that I shot at on campuses and junkyards across North America. And very briefly, this work is related to a series of photographs of brutalist. Is this distorted? Oh, you guys can't tell. Anyway, these photographs I shot brutalist architecture. All the buildings that I shot were the site of famous Vietnam War protests, or they were built shortly after 1968. They were sites which have histories of, obviously, political energy and upheaval. So the body of work as a whole, the photographs and the animation, it aimed to address the campus as this conflicted social space, a site of contested meaning or conflicting understandings of the university and its place, its place in the community. A significant aspect of Weekend Campus, and for all my animations, is this structural emphasis on fixity and mobility. I don't want to naturalize the static, nor do I want to make it pass as film. What I want, or what I'm trying to emphasize, is a tension between both forces. I'm going to show you just a little bit, an excerpt, a tiny, tiny excerpt of this piece to give you a sense. I have no idea how it's going to run here in this context. It's not that still. Is it playing? Oh, there we go. Sorry, it's a little bit. It's jerkier than it usually is. But anyway, very aware of time. So consistently through my work, I've been thinking about the territory between photography and film, and the impact of new technology on the temporality of the photograph. The opposition between still and moving image is, what's interesting to me, it seems to be an interesting form to explore changing social oppositions, like the idea of progress versus the idea of society at a standstill. And in terms of, it's running pretty jerky, but in terms of temporality, the aftermath of an accident can have this tendency to naturalize the static. It's like a dead calm, which seems to stop the flow of time. And when I'm talking about this emphasis on both forces, I think it's a significant aspect of the way we experience all photography now. It's so often, most often, I would say, on screen and in motion. And I read somewhere really recently that 99.999% of photographs will never be printed at this point. They're just experienced on screen. And so even if we just think of the way we experience the stills so often in from QuickTime VR to the immediate display of our digital camera, that's enough of that. We'll go on. To the way we navigate in Photoshop, zooming in and out in a very cinematic way.
What is the full length of the piece?
It's an homage to Godard, a sequence, very famous sequence in Godard's film Weekend, and it's the same duration as that sequence, which is 11 minutes, which was at the time, they said it was the longest tracking shot in history. I don't think that's true anymore. So, I can see where I am on this. Okay, so I've come backwards. Skip. Now it's 2001, or actually, as I was making this work, which was, I started it in 1999. And just a little bit of background, it seems like a million years ago. But when I started it, it was actually a time of great activist optimism. It was right after Seattle, 99, after the WTO negotiations were shut down by these massive street protests. So when I was making this work, there was a lot of excitement about the anti-globalization movement. But actually very little, I thought, critical reevaluation of ideology and strategy, and almost no discussion about how nostalgic most demonstrations were. So very generally, I was hoping these works might evoke a sense of ever-repeating crisis, and sure, crisis in social terms, but also regarding the medium of photography. The same questions that have been posed over and over since the inception of photography about the impact of new technologies, what might have been lost in terms of illusions of the real. I thought this was interesting in relation to lost political illusions. Sorry. So this piece is called Bombardment, and for the series I shot this a very specific style of apartment building, and they're everywhere in Manhattan. Some people call them no-style modernism. And when I was composing them with all the images in this series, I was looking at a lot of photojournalism from the late 60s and referencing specific journalistic images. In fact, for each image, I had these little collections of similar gestures or repeating kind of images. When I was making this one, I had collected a number of AP shots, various Israeli bombardments of Beirut that were all taken from the same hill. So I was thinking about a kind of repeating journalistic image, and also the history of this style of architecture was very, very important to me. It's a history that's perverse, especially in New York. I'm not going to elaborate on it that much, but generally it's about the failed experiment of post-war urban housing projects, a mode of development that's been completely discredited, and how this formula was taken up by other builders throughout the 60s and 70s, and in some cases glazing the brown bricks white for affluent neighborhoods. Anyway, it's a history that's really interesting to me. Now they just embody this failure and a kind of a conflict between the economics of building and the last gasp of utopian city planning. So they were also called, architects I know called them background buildings. And I thought they'd be this perfect stage, or even abstractly a loaded grid to map out these particular actions. This one's called Revolutionary Day, and here's a detail. And so again, when I was making them, I was wanting to make reference to iconic images, mostly from the late 60s, early 70s, images of institutional violence like bombardment, the first image I showed, and images, iconic images of protest, as with this piece. Other pieces in the series had as their source the documentation of avant-garde performances which raised questions about the individual and the social body, the relationship of the body, space, and the environment. This piece references Chris Burden's famous performance. So there was a lot of other references which, looking at these performances, which could ultimately be seen to be about futility, about failure, about sort of fully conscious Don Quixotes acting out. So at the same time that I was making the photographs, I also made these screensavers. And for me, the screensavers are really important in this series because it was, first of all, I was working on them without rotoscoping, and you'll see what I mean. I'll play them in a second, but and so I was working. It's impossible to work with some of these things I shot with a green screen, so I was doing it frame by frame. And as I started to manipulate the video frame by frame, that's what actually led me to be really interested in working with animation. So I'm just going to set that out there. But for me, they also set up, in the context of this show, some interesting temporal reversals and exchanges. It was also important for me to make something that wasn't a product, that was free, that people could download. It was important for me to occupy this site of the desktop, this marginal site. So the origins of these pieces came from accumulating this large archive of video footage I shot at various protests and demonstrations. And when I was looking at this footage after I shot it, what struck me was the monotony of protest strategies, the repetition of generic chants and nostalgic symbols. This struck me as incredibly... I'm going to play this one a little bit for you. Give you an idea. Wait. I think I won't install now. Why does it keep wanting me to install? Sorry. What I'm going to play are projectors. They're not actually... Come on. Oh, it's mirroring strangely. Sorry. These are projectors, but the pieces were actually functioning screensavers. That is, they filled the screen, and they worked like normal screensavers. They used up the excess cycles on your computer when you weren't clicking the mouse. So with these pieces, I was hoping to, what I was trying to do was embody my really conflicted feelings between believing in the necessity of protest, but at the same time feeling, not cynical, I'm never cynical, but acknowledging that a lot of these strategies might be historically exhausted. So as functioning screensavers, the idea was, and this was the May Day parade of 2001 or 2000, I think. The May Day, so as functioning screensavers, the protest begins on your desktop when you stop working. That was the idea. And it continues to generate itself as endlessly repeating nostalgia until you get back to work. So I'll play you the other one. In this one, I had sound. I don't know if it's going to work here, but
Okay, you guys, what do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it?
obviously I edited out
What
the
do we
response
want?
of what people want.
When do we want it? I can't hear you. What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? Okay, you guys, what do we want? When do we want it? Okay, you guys, what do we want? When do we want it? What do we want? When do we want it? I can't hear you. What do we want? When do we want it? When do we want it?
If you downloaded the screensaver, there was a tab that could
When do we want it?
first of all.
What do we want?
Second of all, the longer it runs, the
Okay, you
faster they
guys,
protest,
What do we want?
and the more cacophony.
When do we want it? Okay, you guys.
That thing is. So. And this gesture, these repeating gestures, but this was footage that I, was accumulating myself. And so for me, the juxtaposition when I was making it of these different repeating gestures all in the same body of work, it wasn't to dissolve the crucial differences between these historical moments, but rather to consider the paradox of what they might share. The idea was to explore this territory between continuity and rupture and the relation between the effect of digital manipulation and the workings of historical memory. And out of about 20 photographs, there were actually only 2 which referenced the history of terrorism. This was one of them, and this is a very famous Peter Marlowe shot of Belfast in 1972. But with every image that I made, I wanted to zoom out and have the event, the gesture, recede into the distance to depict these figures as engulfed by the architecture, desaturated, drained of a kind of sparkly, cinematic, colorful depiction of violence that can be so sensationalizing. These were, as I would say, my intentions, which were pretty much eclipsed after the show had opened, because the afterwards, in this case, of the work was kind of this quagmire of unintended topicality. So when I first exhibited this series, just a brief summary, the exhibition opened 5 days before September 11th, 2001. So directly after the World Trade Center attacks, with the proximity of the devastation, any exhibition that remotely referenced the history of terrorism or resembled the destruction of New York architecture was obviously related to the event. And so the work was experienced. It was seen through the lens of what had just happened a few blocks away. And for this panel, Mia asked me to focus specifically on these historical circumstances, to talk about what it was like for me as an artist. And I can try to address these questions, how the meaning of work always changes according to context, how the possibilities of interpretation are always continually shifting, and how the ways in which we read manipulated images have changed in 10 years. I think these are really important questions. But quickly, I do want to acknowledge my self-consciousness in addressing specific questions on how it all unfolded or what it was like for me as an artist. Maybe this is, forgive me if this is too obvious to mention, but talking about this particular exhibition, from my position, there's no small danger of perversity, and I really I've always wanted to avoid a kind of lack of perspective. Obviously, like everyone else watching the events of September 11th, the first thing on my mind was not my exhibition in Chelsea, but I care deeply about my work, obviously. As I said at the time when I was asked to comment, and I still feel to a great extent, that all I can really do is explain my intentions that I had when I was making it. I embraced a certain ambiguity and openness when I made this work. I never wanted to control or ever believed I could, or any other artist can control meaning. Context always shifts interpretation. Clearly, it's not like the photographs meant one thing before September 11th and then one thing afterwards. But after September 11th, the possibilities of interpretation obviously shifted a lot. At the time, all these intentions that I speak about, at that time, the distinctions between the types of actions depicted and their references completely dissolved. Any distance in terms of the images dissolved while the show was up, and then shifted again since the initial reaction, because the work has been shown in other countries which have other histories of terrorism and other histories of institutional violence. So after making and showing this work, some of the questions that I wanted the work to pose were turned into certainties. The interdependency of terrorism and institutional violence is all too clear at this point. And for me, it's not interesting at all to work from a place of certainty like that. But since September 11th, it's more, or since September 11th, so after this work, it's been more important than ever for me to explore political ambivalence, and questions about time and temporality became more important to me. As I described, it was also working on the video frame by frame, which shifted things. So when I was I became thinking about the kind of congested temporality manipulated photography may have, or what it might make present. I think it can emphasize that there's no simple now. Every present is a mix of different times, and consciousness comes afterwards in parallax with distortion. And another thing that as a maker of images and someone who's really interested in how images are produced and consumed right now, what I think some of the old repeated oppositions that have been described as geriatric or exhausted or something, I do think some of these things, these like the past, present, truth, fiction, analog, digital, virtual, real, these frameworks are super limiting at this point, especially within the rhetoric and the discourse of new media. It seems like what seems to be the interesting challenge right now, and a pressing question, is how to frame things differently for photography, how to complicate some of these oppositions which have ossified and generalized simply because I don't believe they reflect the complexity of our experience with images, with photographs right now. And just my time is way over, but just a couple of the questions that I'm challenged by, I'm trying to think about is, really to disturb the way we thought of the relation of between past and present in relationship to photography and cinema, and trauma. And I think a conjunction of the virtual and the traumatic needs to be conceptualized differently. I think that even the still motion opposition should be more constructively reframed now that mobility is not necessarily attached to actual motion with the photographs. But at this point, I think it'd be more interesting if we opened it up to discussion.
Thank you, Nancy, for talking about that work. I know it was a while ago that you did it. It just it seems so relevant to this exhibition, to the two exhibitions upstairs, and to the just the general use of manipulation historically to depict things that the camera couldn't capture, wasn't there to capture, things that might even be happening in the future or not be happening at all. And so, your use of photography and digital compositing to create these fictions out of real images, seem very close to work that was being done, in the 19th century, early 20th century, sort of using the realism of photography to add an edge, to sort of give your fictions an edge that makes them even more compelling than if, like, these had been paintings that had been shown in the same circumstances. It might have, people would have looked at them differently, obviously, in light of September 11th, but the fact that they're photographs, just sort of, you're using the truth value of photography, in a particular way, to throw things into question and to create a sense of ambiguity about what's going on, and is this something that happened in the past or in the future? And I just think the work is very interesting. Does anybody have any questions or comments about it?
Oh, I just want to sort of, maybe I'm slow. I just want to throw something back that's been floating around, and even I was saying, let's try to get beyond this truth and lies framework. Maybe something is more constructive. And then in previous presentations and questions, people were saying, well, why do we care? It's clear we, this is an illusion. We don't believe in this anymore. But why do we care? It seems that there's a lot to care about. Can we afford to give it up? Because the photography has this really important capacity and role for witnessing oppression, and we still, I think everybody has a stake in its role of witnessing. So the anxiety about that, even though we don't believe we need something to fulfill that role. So maybe I'm slow, but I think that's why we care. It's not some generalized, like, oh, we've lost Roland Barthes' punctum, like, who cares? That it's something else is at stake, right?
Yeah.
I'm really intrigued by your work, and I love it. And especially the way you articulate the relationship to film and how important that is to you, and the time of film, and your slow motion animations are great. And hearing you talk about it really gave me a sense that what you're doing seems to me different from the manipulation that we've been talking about today, in a way, because you really are, as you put it finally at the end, I think, sort of entering a space where you're exploiting the ambiguities in a way where you want them in suspension and not want to be resolved. And I just finished reading Don DeLillo's Point Omega, and I don't know whether you've read it, but it is the perfect equivalent, if there can be such in prose, of some of what you're talking about. And I really, it's a great book, and he talks exactly about the state of mind of someone who is in a museum looking at a slow motion version of Psycho. And he exploits that for many pages. That's how it begins, and then it goes into some other things. But he gets into the psychology of looking at film in slow motion and its relationship to reality. And it's just along the same lines that you were talking about here. So that's a comment before they question.
Thank you. Interesting.
I find myself thinking about Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein, where he was told when he first showed it that it doesn't look like her, and he said, "Well, don't worry, it will." Which leads me to some sort of half-formulated idea about a predictive quality to art that sometimes the artist may understand, and sometimes the artist may not understand, but that in some ways that I'm also reminded of Norman Mailer being excoriated right after September 11th for suggesting that the engineering of the attack was an act of genius, creative genius, and of course that's a terrible thing to say, bad Norman, but the fact of the matter is there was an imaginative act there as well. And so in a certain sense, we're at a point where if it can be imagined, which would include by whatever our villain is, whether our villain is quote-unquote terrorist, whether our villain is the corporate state, whatever, or whether the villain is artist, if it can be imagined, it quite probably can happen. And if it can happen, there's great likelihood that it will happen, and that yours is not going to be the only experience of making a work of art that somehow, sooner or later, intersects with some major event in the world.
Well, we know it wasn't our culture had fantasized attacks on New York City for years, and in Hollywood, Zizek talks about that at length, about Welcome to the Desert of the Real. It's like what had been repeated and repeated as a fantasy had happened, and I'm uncomfortable with the predictive thing. It's either I feel like that I'm uncomfortable with either a sort of self-aggrandization of thing of that, but also like the idiot savant artist thing of that. You know, like you know what I mean?
Yeah, but I don't mean either of those.
I'm sure you don't. But it seems like it seems like an uncomfortable position when you know, certain things that were unconscious in the culture and had become just on the surface, you know, like the whole Zizek thing. But I'm bringing this back up, not just because I'm working on this now, but because it does the idea of the event, and what I think is interesting about this work is that it's equally as manipulated as the work in 2001. But I'm shooting the Security Council chamber now, and it is going through a process of renovation for the first time since its construction in 1951. And I'm interested in this moment that is a moment of complete sort of a skeletal a bareness in this super symbolic room, where you can still see the outline of the horseshoe table that's in all of our collective memories, but it's between, basically it's at the same moment there is an intense debate about the necessary reforms that need to happen with the Security Council. And these conversations are taking place right at the moment where they're renovating the building. And I'm interested in this state, although I'm manipulating the image a lot. I'm interested in the state not because of necessarily an event or depicting an event in the same way that I used to, but just in the in-between aspect of this, that whatever we think of the architects that are doing the renovation, he approached the Secretary General and said, hey, this is costing billions of dollars, and we know that at some point there's got to be more people on the Security Council. They've got to change that. And the Secretary General said, why don't we change the design so that there's more room? And so when eventually it changes, and Secretary General said, no way, architecture does not define politics, and which made my head explode. And I think it's at this point where there is a possibility. I'm talking about this because I'm interested in sort of a virtual actual opposition instead of virtual real. The idea of a possibility and in-betweenness of this space now before it turns back into what it was. And that's very different, I think, from the kind of event thing that you were making reference to. Wow, that was really long-winded. So, sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
How was it manipulated?
There's tons of structural manipulations, tons of detail manipulations, and light, and lots of light manipulation.
Could you elaborate on that? What you just told us about a different kind of opposition, virtual.
I'm reading Deleuze. And I say that with my face like this because I find it really exciting and inspiring. I don't agree. I think it's cinema studies, and there's certain things that he says about the photographic and the film that I think are not, I'm understanding them in a different way, and but I understand what he says about the present and actuality as a very interesting and related to how we experience photography now. And I'm still thinking about these things, and I'm certainly not, I don't want to talk about Deleuze right now after, 4 hours of, I just crashed your 19th century photo party, but that was that's actually what I'm thinking about, and I know lots of people have been thinking about that for a long time, but I'm still negotiating how I disagree with that, and disagree with Deleuze, disagree with how he takes off from Bergson, disagree with how people have written about it, agree, and I'm inspired by how some people have written about it.
Well, thank you very much. I just have to say that I have always liked those white brick buildings perversely.
Really?
Yeah, my grandparents lived in one of the ones on 9th Street. They moved in like right when it was built, and so I always grew up going to those buildings. And now, but since I've never really looked at them the same again after your work. They just sort of I notice them now. And they really are still everywhere in Manhattan. So. Well, anyway, I'd like to thank you all for coming today, and especially the speakers who just did a fantastic, fabulous, thought-provoking job.